In 1872, Dodge City did not exist. By 1876, it was the most dangerous town in America. By 1886, it was finished. 14 years. That is the entire arc of Dodge City as the world came to know it. From empty Kansas prairie to the capital of the cattle trade, to a quiet agricultural community that had outgrown the chaos that made it famous. The mythology of Dodge City has lasted considerably longer than the reality. But the reality is the more interesting story. This is the documented history of how Dodge City actually rose, how it actually operated during the Lawless years, and how it actually ended. Not the legend, the record. The site that would become Dodge City was chosen not for its geography or its resources, but for its position relative to a railroad. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad reached the area along the Arkansas River in southwestern Kansas in the summer of 1872. Fort Dodge, a military post established in 1865, was already present nearby. The railroad needed a supply point. Buffalo hunters needed a market for the hides they were taking from the southern plains in enormous numbers. The combination produced a town. The first structures appeared in 1872 as the railroad construction crews moved through. They were rough, temporary, and designed for a single purpose: to serve the men working the railroad and the buffalo hunters who were already operating across the southern plains. Saloons and trading posts came first. Permanent structures came second. The question of law and governance came much later. The buffalo hunting economy that sustained Dodge City in its first years was enormous in scale and brief in duration. In 1872 and 1873, the southern herd of the American bison was still vast. Hundreds of thousands of animals moved through the range south of the Arkansas River. The railroad gave hunters a way to ship hides east to tanneries that could process them into commercial leather. The result was a commercial hunting operation of industrial scale. Professional hunters with large caliber rifles, teams of skinners to process the animals, freight wagons to transport the hides to the railroad, and Dodge City at the center of it all as the hub through which the commerce flowed. The hide trade produced a town of a specific character. It was a town of men. Young men, mostly, who had come to do physically demanding and often dangerous work in remote conditions, and who came back to town periodically to spend what they had earned. The infrastructure that appeared to serve them was the infrastructure of male entertainment in the 19th century. Saloons, gambling establishments, and the commercial sexual economy that accompanied them. Law enforcement was minimal. The social norms that regulated behavior in established communities were absent or weakly established. Violence was not inevitable in this environment, but it was common. The population of Dodge City in its early years was heavily armed, heavily drinking, and operating without the institutional constraints that normally regulate conflict. The men who came to the buffalo camps and returned to Dodge City were not primarily violent men, but they were men in conditions that made violence more likely than it would be elsewhere. Conditions of stress, alcohol, cash, and the absence of consequences. The documented record of Dodge City in its early years shows a pattern of interpersonal conflict. Fights that escalated beyond what they would have escalated to in other contexts because more people were armed, because the night was long and the whiskey was cheap, and because the social authority that normally intervened before conflicts became fatal was either absent or overwhelmed. The transition from Buffalo Town to Cattle Town happened between 1875 and 1876. The southern herd was effectively destroyed by 1878. The commercial hunting economy that had sustained the first phase of Dodge City's existence was exhausted. But the cattle industry had already begun to fill the gap. The cattle drives that had been moving north from Texas since the late 1860s had been going to Abilene, then to Wichita, then to Ellsworth. each successive Kansas cattle town serving as the northern terminus of the Chisholm and Western Trails until local agricultural development made the cattle drives unwelcome, and the railhead moved west. Dodge City, at the western edge of the Kansas settled area, became the cattle terminus in 1875 and held that position for the next decade. The cattle drive economy transformed Dodge City in ways that intensified its existing character. At the end of a cattle drive, a cowboy who had ridden for 3 or 4 months through difficult and dangerous conditions arrived in Dodge City with several months' wages in his pocket, significant physical exhaustion, and a powerful desire for the relief and entertainment that wages could buy. He was not fundamentally different from the buffalo hunters who had preceded him. He was young, armed, and operating in an environment without familiar social constraints. The cattle season ran roughly from late spring through early fall, when the drives arrived from Texas. During this period, Dodge City's population swelled with the cowboys who came in with the herds, and the drovers, merchants, gamblers, and entertainment workers who came to serve them. The front street of Dodge City during cattle season in the late 1870s was one of the densest concentrations of commercial activity in the American West, and one of the most chaotic. The ordinances that Dodge City passed attempting to regulate firearms on its main street reflected the specific problem that armed men in a high-density entertainment district created. The ordinance prohibiting the carrying of firearms north of the railroad tracks. The side of the tracks where the main commercial district was located was the primary legal instrument through which Dodge City attempted to manage its violence problem. It was not consistently enforced. The men who came to Dodge City after months on the trail were not reliably inclined to check their weapons at the edge of town. The lawmen who were supposed to enforce the ordinance were operating with minimal backup against men who had no particular reason to comply. The law enforcement officers who served in Dodge City during its cattle town years were a specific type of frontier professional. They were men who combined physical courage with a specific kind of social intelligence, the ability to read a situation, identify who could be managed and who would require force, and make those judgments under conditions of alcohol, darkness, and the constant possibility of rapid escalation. They were not heroes of legend. They were working men who had taken a dangerous job at modest wages and who performed it with varying degrees of competence and integrity. The most effective of them succeeded not primarily through intimidation or fighting ability, though both were sometimes required. They succeeded through presence, through reputation, and through the specific frontier social skill of making clear to armed and drunk men that the consequences of continued escalation were worse than the consequences of backing down. The lawman who could diffuse a situation without drawing was more valuable than the one who drew quickly, because the dead body on the floor created more problems than it solved. The mythology of Dodge City has focused almost entirely on the moments of actual confrontation, the gunfights, the arrests made under threat, the occasions when the managed tension of the cattle season street finally broke into something worse. These moments were real. They were also exceptional. The daily reality of law enforcement in Dodge City was more tedious and more complex than the mythology suggests. A constant negotiation between the economic interests of the entertainment district, the desire of the cattle trade for enough order to make commerce possible, and the individual behavior of men who were operating far from any social authority they recognized. The business interests of Dodge City were divided on the question of law enforcement in ways that made consistent policy impossible. The saloon owners, the gambling operators, and the businesses that served the cattle season entertainment economy had a direct financial interest in maintaining conditions that attracted cowboys and their wages. Too much law enforcement would drive the trade to communities with fewer restrictions. The merchants, the property owners, and the civic-minded residents who were beginning to think about Dodge City's long-term future wanted enough order to make permanent settlement possible. Between these two interests, the law enforcement of Dodge City navigated. The result was a specific kind of frontier governance that was neither the complete absence of law that pure mythology suggests, nor the imposition of Eastern legal norms that the civic faction wanted. It was a negotiated order, tolerating enough to keep the trade coming while suppressing enough to prevent the complete breakdown that would have made the trade impossible. The women of Dodge City occupied an unusual position in this social landscape. The mythology has populated Dodge City with dance hall girls and respectable wives in roughly equal measure, but the documented demographics tell a different story. In the cattle season years of the late 1870s, Dodge City was a male-dominated community in which women who were present operated in a narrow range of economic roles. Those who ran boarding houses, operated restaurants, or provided domestic services could earn considerably more than they could in established Eastern communities. Those who worked in the entertainment district occupied a complex social position that the period's documentation captures only partially. The Chinese laundry operators and cooks who were present in Dodge City during its cattle season years, as in virtually every frontier community of the period, are almost entirely absent from the mythology. They were present, they were economically significant, and they were subject to the same legal disadvantages and occasional violence that characterized the treatment of Chinese residents across the frontier West. The year 1878 was probably the peak of Dodge City's lawless reputation. It was the year in which the documented homicide rate was at its highest. It was the year in which the Front Street Entertainment District was at its most active. And it was the year in which the social tension between the cattle season economy and the emerging agricultural economy of the surrounding region was at its most acute. The farmers who were homesteading the Kansas plains around Dodge City needed fenced fields. The cattle drives needed open range through which to move their herds to the railhead. These were incompatible requirements, and the resolution of the conflict, which favored the farmers, was already determining the future of the cattle trade and of Dodge City itself. The barbed wire that was transforming the Kansas plains in the late 1870s was not only an agricultural technology, it was a political statement. Each mile of fence was a declaration that the land it enclosed was going to be farmed, not grazed, and that the open-range cattle economy was going to have to find another route or another destination. The cattle drives continued into Dodge City through the early 1880s, but the conditions they faced were changing rapidly. The range north of Dodge City was increasingly fenced. The political pressure from the agricultural community against the cattle trade was increasing. The Texas fever quarantine, which restricted the movement of Texas longhorns into areas where their disease exposure threatened local cattle, was being enforced more rigorously. By 1885, the cattle drives to Dodge City were largely over. The ordinance that the Dodge City town government passed in 1885, prohibiting the driving of Texas cattle through settled portions of Ford County, was the formal acknowledgement of what economics and geography had already determined. The cattle trade moved west into Colorado and the Panhandle regions where the range was still open. Dodge City was left with the agricultural economy that the farming community had been building alongside the cattle trade for a decade. The transformation was not a collapse. It was a transition. The Dodge City that survived the end of the cattle trade was a different town than the one that had existed during the lawless years. It had churches, schools, a more stable population, commercial infrastructure oriented toward serving the agricultural community rather than the seasonal cattle trade. It was, in short, becoming a normal Kansas town. The mythology arrived after the reality had already changed. The dime novels and the newspaper accounts that created the Dodge City of popular imagination were being written and circulated in the 1880s and 1890s, precisely as the actual Dodge City was becoming a quiet agricultural community. The gap between the legend and the reality was not accidental. The legend served the interests of the Eastern reading public that consumed frontier mythology as entertainment. It served the interests of former Dodge City residents who preferred the heroic version of their community's history to the complicated documented reality, and it served the interests of the entertainment industry that has been producing Dodge City stories in one form or another ever since. The real Dodge City of the Lawless years was more interesting than the legend, because the legend reduces a complex social organism to a simple moral narrative of heroes and villains, order and chaos. The reality was a community that organized itself rapidly around a series of extractive economic activities, buffalo hunting, cattle trading, that produced enormous revenue flows in short bursts and attracted the specific population those activities required. That population created the specific social problems that accompanied young armed men operating without established institutions. The institutions that appeared in response, the law enforcement, the ordinances, the civic organizations, were themselves shaped by the conflicting economic interests of the community they served. It was, in short, a boomtown with a specific identity. And like every boomtown, it transformed or disappeared when the boom ended. Dodge City transformed. It is still there. The cattle season chaos of the 1870s is gone, replaced by a community that has made its peace with the mythology precisely because the mythology brings tourists to a town that the actual cattle trade left behind more than a century ago. The lawless years lasted perhaps a decade, from the mid-1870s to the mid-1880s. In that decade, a specific combination of economic forces, geographic circumstances, and human behavior produced the most famous small town in the history of the American West. What made it famous was real. What made it famous was also temporary. And what replaced it, the ordinary Kansas agricultural community that Dodge City has been for the last century and more, tells its own story about what the frontier actually became when the boom was over and the work of building something permanent had to begin. That is the true history of Dodge City, not the legend, the documented, complicated, economically determined, humanly imperfect reality of 14 years that built a myth and then moved on to building a town. The geography that made Dodge City possible deserves specific attention, because geography was the foundation of everything that followed. The Arkansas River crossing at the site of Dodge City was one of the most reliable water crossings in southwestern Kansas. The Santa Fe Trail, which had been the primary commercial route between the Missouri River and Santa Fe since the 1820s, passed directly through the area. When the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad followed the Santa Fe Trail west in the early 1870s, it was following the path that commerce and water had already established. The military post at Fort Dodge had been placed there in 1865 to protect the trail traffic from conflict with the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples, whose territory the trail crossed. By 1872, the military situation had changed enough that the fort was less critical for its original purpose. What it provided to the emerging town was a reliable market for supplies and a degree of institutional presence that gave the early community some minimal connection to governmental authority. The Arkansas River itself was the boundary between the cattle range to the south and the more settled agricultural country to the north. The Texas Longhorns that would eventually define Dodge City's cattle trade era came from south of the river. The farmers who would eventually end the cattle trade era were settling north of it. The town sat precisely at the point where these two economic systems met. The front street of Dodge City, the commercial district that ran north of the railroad tracks, and the district south of the tracks that was sometimes called the South Side or the Flats, represented the two faces of the cattle trade town. North of the tracks were the more established businesses, the general stores, the hotels that served commercial travelers, the newspaper office, the dry goods merchants who served the farming families of the surrounding region. This was the face of Dodge City that aspired to permanence and respectability. South of the tracks was where the cattle season entertainment economy concentrated itself. The dance halls, the lower-tier saloons, the establishments that served the cowboys who arrived with the herds, and the gamblers and workers who served the cowboys. This was the face of Dodge City that produced the mythology. The two districts were not rigidly separated. Men crossed between them constantly. The same person might conduct legitimate business on Front Street in the morning and spend the evening's wages in the South Side establishments after dark. But the social geography of Dodge City reflected a genuine division between the community that was trying to build something permanent and the economy that was extracting wealth from the cattle trade while it lasted. The seasonal nature of the cattle trade gave Dodge City a rhythm that distinguished it from most frontier communities. The cattle drives arrived in late spring and early summer, when the trail grass was sufficient for driving large herds north from Texas. They continued through the summer. By October, the drives were finished for the year, and Dodge City contracted dramatically. The cowboys who had filled the saloons and gambling halls departed with whatever remained of their wages. The merchants who served the cattle trade saw their revenue drop sharply. The law enforcement problems that accompanied the cattle season diminished with the departure of the men who had created them. Winter in Dodge City was quiet in a way that the mythology never captured. The population dropped to a fraction of its cattle season peak. The saloons were open but less crowded. The gambling establishments were operating but with lower stakes and fewer customers. The town was, in winter, a small Kansas prairie community that happened to have an unusually large commercial infrastructure relative to its permanent population. This seasonal rhythm produced a specific kind of civic identity. The permanent residents of Dodge City, the merchants, the property owners, the families who had put down roots, had a fundamentally different relationship to the community than the seasonal workers who filled it in summer. The permanent residents were building something they intended to live in permanently. The seasonal workers were passing through, and the policies, the governance, and the identity of Dodge City were shaped by the tension between these two groups. The documented record of Dodge City's law enforcement shows that the period of maximum violence was shorter than the mythology suggests. The years from roughly 1875 to 1878 were the most dangerous. After 1878, the combination of more experienced law enforcement, clearer ordinances, and the beginning of the agricultural community's political influence produced a gradual reduction in the homicide rate. By 1880, Dodge City was still rougher than a normal Kansas town, but it was significantly less violent than it had been at its peak. The lawmen who served during the most dangerous years were effective in direct proportion to their ability to maintain a reputation that made enforcement unnecessary in most cases. A man who was known to be fast and accurate with a weapon, and who was known to be willing to use that weapon, created a deterrent effect that reduced the frequency with which the weapon needed to be drawn. The theater of frontier law enforcement, the public demonstrations of authority, the visible presence on Front Street during cattle season, the selective enforcement that made clear that certain behaviors would not be tolerated, was as important as the actual exercise of force. The gamblers who operated in Dodge City during the cattle years were a professional class with their own internal hierarchy and their own code of conduct. Professional gambling in the frontier West was not a marginal or disreputable enterprise in the way that later mythology sometimes suggests. It was a legitimate business that occupied a recognized social space in communities like Dodge City. The professional gambler ran games that provided entertainment to cowboys who wanted to spend their wages, took the mathematical edge that made the enterprise profitable, and generally maintained the social order of the gambling establishment because disorder was bad for business. The relationship between the professional gamblers who operated in Dodge City and the law enforcement of the town was complex. Some of the most prominent gamblers in Dodge City were also involved in law enforcement at various points. Some served as deputies or as informal auxiliaries to the town marshal. The overlap between the gambling and law enforcement communities reflected the specific social structure of a frontier town, in which a small number of capable and ambitious men occupied multiple roles simultaneously. The cattle drives that supplied Dodge City with its primary economic raison d'etre were themselves remarkable logistical operations. A typical cattle drive from Texas to Dodge City involved a herd of 1,000 to 3,000 longhorn cattle, a trail boss, and perhaps 8 to 15 cowboys. The drive took 3 to 4 months, covering a distance of roughly 800 to 1,000 kilometers from the Texas ranches to the Kansas railhead. The route was determined by water, grass, and the need to avoid fenced land and hostile reception from farming communities along the way. The economics of the cattle drive were calculated carefully. The Texas Longhorn that was worth $3 or $4 in Texas was worth $25 to $30 in Kansas after the drive. The profit margin was sufficient to justify the considerable expense and risk of the operation. The possibility of losing animals to injury, disease, or the river crossings that killed cattle in numbers that trail bosses kept careful records of. The cowboys who made these drives were an economically essential and socially marginal group. They were skilled workers. Managing large numbers of animals on horseback across difficult terrain required real expertise and physical endurance. They were also poorly paid relative to the value they generated for the ranching enterprises that employed them. A cowboy who completed a cattle drive to Dodge City earned $30 to $40 a month for 3 to 4 months of difficult work. After paying for a new outfit at the Dodge City stores and spending several days in the entertainment district, many returned to Texas with little to show for the summer's work. The physical environment of Dodge City during cattle season was one of the more challenging urban environments in the American West. The Arkansas River dust that the prevailing southwest wind carried into town coated everything. The smell of cattle, of the herds that were held in pens near the railroad for shipping, of the cattle that had been driven through the streets, of the hides and tallow and the biological evidence of 10,000 animals moving through a small community, was pervasive. The flies that accompanied the cattle operations were a constant nuisance. The mud of the main street after rain and the dust of the same street in dry weather were equally unpleasant. The hotels and boarding houses that served the cattle season visitors were overcrowded. The food available in the commercial establishments was adequate at best, and frequently worse. The water supply was the Arkansas River, which was used for every purpose from drinking to washing to the disposal of waste, with predictable consequences for public health. Typhoid and dysentery were recurring problems in Dodge City during the cattle years, as they were in virtually every frontier community that depended on a river for its water supply. The end of Dodge City's cattle trade era was not a dramatic event. It was a process. The quarantine lines that restricted Texas cattle from entering Kansas moved steadily south and west through the early 1880s as the agricultural community's political influence grew. The fencing of the Kansas range eliminated the open corridor through which the drives had moved. The extension of the railroad deeper into Texas reduced the economic justification for the long drives to Kansas, and the cattle industry itself was changing, moving toward more localized ranching operations with less dependence on the long drives. By 1885, the cattle drives to Dodge City were largely over. The town that had processed the cattle trade for a decade had to find a different economic identity. The agricultural community that had been growing around Dodge City throughout the cattle years provided that identity. The farmers who had been homesteading Ford County since the 1870s were now producing wheat and raising cattle of their own for the local packing industry that was developing to serve the regional market. The economy of Dodge City shifted from the spectacular seasonal revenue of the cattle trade to the steadier and more modest revenue of serving a farming community. the transition required the town to shed some of the infrastructure that had served the cattle trade. The dance halls and the lower-tier saloons of the South Side closed or transformed as their customers stopped coming. The law enforcement. Challenges that had accompanied the cattle season diminished along with the cattle season population. The civic institutions that the permanent population had been building throughout the cattle years. The churches, the schools, the civic organizations became more central to the community's identity as the cattle trade receded. The Dodge City that emerged from this transition was a quieter, more ordinary, and in many respects more functional community than the one that had existed during the lawless years. It had survived its boom. It had built the institutional foundation that made survival possible. And it had, in the process, become exactly the kind of normal American small town that the mythology of Dodge City has never been particularly interested in. The mythology has proved more durable than the reality it was supposed to describe. Dodge City remains, more than a century after the end of the lawless years, the most recognized name in the history of the American frontier. The television programs, the films, the novels, and the popular historical accounts that have used Dodge City as their setting have collectively created an image of the town that has almost no relationship to the documented historical record. In the mythology, Dodge City is permanently in the moment of maximum drama. The cattle season street of the late 1870s, frozen at the point of greatest tension, populated by heroic lawmen and dangerous outlaws in a landscape of clear moral conflict. The farmers who actually ended the cattle trade are absent. The Chinese residents who operated the laundries and restaurants are absent. The seasonal workers who filled the saloons and left with diminished wages are reduced to background extras. The agricultural community that built something lasting is invisible. What remains is the moment of crisis, elevated to myth and stripped of context. The real Dodge City was more interesting, more complicated, and more human than the myth. It was a community that organized itself around a series of economic opportunities, managed the social problems those opportunities created with imperfect and interesting tools, and eventually transitioned to a different economic identity when the original opportunities were exhausted. That is the story of the American frontier in miniature, not the heroic myth of civilization taming the wilderness. The complicated, economically driven, humanly imperfect process by which a community appeared, functioned, and evolved in response to the forces that shaped it. Dodge City did both. It rose, it fell, and then it did what the mythology never acknowledges. It continued. The documented homicide statistics of Dodge City during its cattle trade years require some context to be properly understood. The homicide rate was high by the standards of established American communities. It was not extraordinary by the standards of frontier mining and cattle towns. Deadwood and Tombstone had comparable or higher rates during their peak years. What distinguished Dodge City was not the level of violence, but the concentration of documentation. Dodge City had multiple competing newspapers from an early date. Those newspapers recorded events in detail. The records that survive are more complete than for most comparable communities. The mythology of Dodge City's violence rests in part on the fact that its violence was unusually well documented. The documented deaths in Dodge City during the cattle years include a significant number that were the result of alcohol-fueled altercations that escalated beyond what was intended by either party. A fight that began over a gambling debt or an insult became fatal because both parties were armed, and because the social mechanisms that normally intervene before a fight becomes a killing were absent or ineffective. The premeditated, dramatically staged gunfight of popular mythology was rarer than the messy, improvised, regretted the morning after violence of men who were drunk and armed and young and far from home. The guns themselves deserve attention as a social fact of Dodge City life. The ordinances restricting firearms north of the railroad tracks acknowledged the specific danger that resulted from combining alcohol with readily available lethal weapons in an environment without reliable institutional control. The frontier West was an armed society in a way that most of the eastern United States was not. The frontier conditions that made weapons useful for a range of practical purposes: hunting, defense against animal and human threats in remote terrain, also made them socially present in contexts where their presence was a hazard. The lawmen who enforced the firearms ordinances in Dodge City were themselves armed and operated in an environment where the threat of force was the primary tool of law enforcement. The negotiation between armed authority and armed citizens that defined frontier law enforcement was a negotiation conducted at a specific level of mutual risk that had no equivalent in more established legal environments. It produced, when it worked, a specific kind of public order. When it failed, it produced the documented violence that gave Dodge City its reputation.